The world ended not with a roar, but with a deep, guttural groan from the belly of the earth. One moment, Harlan Wade was swinging his pickaxe, the rhythmic strike a lonely heartbeat in the oppressive silence of the abandoned comet mine. The next, the ground shuddered. Timbers, ancient and brittle as bone, splintered overhead. A cascade of rock and dust thundered down, and the fragile beam of his lantern was swallowed by an absolute, suffocating blackness. Dust filled his lungs, a thick, gritty paste that stole his breath. He scrambled backward on instinct, the sharp edges of fallen rock tearing at his hands. When the torrent ceased, the silence that returned was different. It was heavier, sealed, the silence of a tomb. Harlan lay still, his heart hammering against his ribs, each beat a frantic drum against the void. Panic, cold and sharp, coiled in his gut. He had come to this forgotten mine near Nevada's Dust Devil Gulch in 1878 not to find his fortune, but to lose himself. In the deep quiet of the earth, the ghosts of his wife, Martha, and his little girl, Lily, were fainter, their laughter less piercing than under the vast, empty sky. He had sought a place to be alone with his grief, and the mountain had obliged by making his solitude permanent. His lantern was gone, likely shattered and buried. He fumbled in his pockets, his fingers closing around the small, waterproof tin of matches. Hope, a fragile flicker, sparked within him. He struck the first match. The flare was blinding, a brief, violent sun that revealed the wall of rock and splintered timber that now blocked the tunnel. It was a complete collapse. He was sealed in. The match burned his fingers and died, plunging him back into the profound, disorienting dark. He struck another, his movements now frantic. He had to find a way out, a fissure, another tunnel. But the second match revealed nothing but solid, unforgiving rock in every direction. As its light died, despair, a familiar and heavy cloak, settled over him. This was it, then, an anonymous end for a man who had already lost everything that mattered. He slumped against the cold stone, the will to fight draining from him. Let the darkness take him. Let the silence be his final companion. It was in that moment of surrender that he heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound. Tap, 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 tap. It was soft, yet it cut through the silence with the clarity of a bell. Harlan froze, straining his ears. Had the rockfall addled his mind? Was he imagining things? He held his breath, listening. There it was again. Tap, 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 tap. It was coming from deeper in the mine, from a direction he hadn't known existed. It was deliberate, measured, impossible. No one had worked these tunnels in 20 years. Prospectors were a superstitious lot, and the comet was considered played out and haunted, a place where the unwary were swallowed by the earth. Yet the sound was undeniably real. A new instinct, one he hadn't felt since the fever took his family, pushed aside the despair. Curiosity. He had to know. Using his hands to guide him, he began to move toward the sound, shuffling through the darkness, the rough wall a lifeline. The air grew colder, the tunnel narrowing. The tapping grew louder, more distinct, a steady, patient signal in the heart of the mountain. It led him to a place where the man-made tunnel gave way to a natural fissure, a crack in the rock barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. The tapping was coming from the other side. With a grunt of effort, Harlan pushed himself through the opening, his clothes snagging on sharp rock, his shoulders scraping against the stone. He emerged into a small, natural cavern, and for the first time, he saw a light. It was a faint, ethereal glow filtering down from a crack high in the ceiling, illuminating a scene that defied all reason. In the center of the chamber sat a child. She couldn't have been more than 7. A small, spectral figure in a dress of rags, her hair a tangled mat, her face smudged with dirt. Her eyes, wide and luminous in the gloom, fixed on him without fear. In her small hand, she held a piece of quartz, and with it, she was methodically striking the rock wall, creating the very rhythm that had guided him. Tap, 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 tap. For a long moment, Harlan could only stare, his mind struggling to reconcile the impossible reality before him. A child, alive, alone, deep within the earth. She stopped tapping, her head cocked as if listening to an answer only she could hear. She looked at him, then at the wall beside her, and pointed a thin finger at a specific spot. Then, she began to tap again, not on the wall, but on the ground before her, a new, more urgent pattern. It was a summons, an instruction. Harlan's rational mind screamed at him to flee, that this was some hallucination born of grief and oxygen deprivation. But his prospector's instincts, and something deeper, something paternal that he thought had died with Lily, took over. He moved forward, pulling his last unbroken pickaxe from his belt. He felt the spot she had indicated. The rock sounded different, duller, less solid. Hefting the pickaxe, he swung. The tool struck with a deep, satisfying thud, not the sharp crack of solid granite. He swung again, and a chunk of rock broke away, revealing something that glittered in the faint light. Harlan's breath caught. He knelt, scraping away more rock with his bare hands. It wasn't just a flicker. It was a thick, solid band of native silver, a vein wider than his hand, disappearing deep into the rock. It was the kind of strike men dreamed of, fought for, and died for. A king's ransom, hidden in a dead mine. He looked from the impossible wealth to the impossible child. She watched him, her expression unchanging, her tapping now slow and steady. She had led him here. She had saved him from the rockfall and guided him to a fortune. He felt a wave of dizziness, the enormity of the discovery and the mystery of the child overwhelming him. He had entered the comet mine seeking an end and had found a beginning. But as he looked at the gleaming silver, a cold dread settled in his heart. A find like this wasn't a blessing in a place like Dust Devil Gulch. It was a death warrant. Silas Sill Blackwood, the man who ran the town with an iron fist and a network of spies, believed that any mineral wealth in this territory belonged to him by right. The child, this small, silent ghost of the mountain, had just handed Harlan a secret that would get them both killed if it ever came to light. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw past the dirt and rags. He saw the fierce, unbroken spirit in her luminous eyes. She was a survivor. And now, against all logic, against every instinct for self-preservation he had left, so was he. His life, and hers, were now intertwined. Their fates bound together by a vein of silver in the echoing taps in the dark. The ascent from the earth's belly was a painful birth into a world Harlan had forgotten. He pushed the last of the rocks from a narrow, secondary shaft he discovered, a path the old-timers had used for ventilation, and the sunlight hit him like a physical blow. It was a searing, white-hot blade that sliced into his eyes, forcing him to recoil with a cry of pain. Behind him, Alara whimpered, a low, animal sound of terror, and scrambled back into the darkness of the shaft. After days in the deep gloom, the vast, open sky was not a symbol of freedom, but an unbearable assault. Harlan shielded his eyes, blinking against the brilliant, painful tears that streamed down his face. The world came into focus slowly, the jagged peaks of the surrounding mountains, the endless sagebrush stretching to a horizon that seemed 1,000 miles away, the sheer, crushing emptiness of it all. He understood her fear. Out here, there was nowhere to hide. "It's all right," he said, his voice a rough croak. "We're safe." It was a lie, and they both knew it. He reached back into the darkness, his hand finding her small, trembling one. "Come on, there's shelter nearby." She resisted, pulling back. But his grip was firm. He gently coaxed her out, keeping her in the shadow of the rock face as her eyes, pupils still wide as moons, struggled to adjust. She kept her head down, her world shrinking to the patch of dusty ground at her feet. His cabin, a mile from the mine's entrance, was less a home than a shelter. Built of rough-hewn timber, it was a single room with a stone hearth, a narrow cot, and a few crates for furniture. It was the physical manifestation of his grief, functional, barren, and profoundly lonely. To Alara, it must have seemed a palace. As soon as they were inside, she darted away from him, scuttling into the darkest corner behind a stack of empty supply crates. She curled into a tight ball, making herself as small as possible, a creature of the shadows seeking familiar comfort. Harlan watched her, a painful ache blooming in his chest. He saw not a feral child, but his own Lily, hiding during a game of hide-and-seek. He pushed the memory down, a familiar, bitter discipline. He poured a cup of water from the bucket and placed it near her hiding spot, along with a piece of dried jerky. "You need to eat," he said softly. She didn't move, her eyes, luminous even in the dimness of the cabin, watched his every move. He sighed and turned away, giving her the space she needed. The cabin felt different now. Her small, silent presence had filled the emptiness, replacing the quiet of grief with the tension of a held breath. He looked around the sparse room and realized how unprepared he was. He had no proper food, no clothes for a child, nothing to offer her but this bleak, masculine solitude. He would have to go to town. The thought of Dust Devil Gulch sent a sour taste to his mouth. He'd avoided the place for months, preferring the honesty of the mountain to the town's festering greed. It was Syl Blackwood's town. Every saloon, every card table, every assay office paid tribute to him. Blackwood had the predatory stillness of a patient wolf. His foreman, Jed, the brutishness of a bear. Men like them could smell desperation and opportunity, and Harlan now reeked of both. Before leaving, he knelt near Alara's corner. "I'm going for supplies," he said, speaking slowly, as if to a frightened animal. "I'll be back before the sun is high. You'll be safe here. No one will bother you." She just stared, her silence an unnerving, constant judgment. He left the heavy cabin door unbarred, knowing a lock would only make it a cage for her. Dust Devil Gulch was a scar on the landscape, a single dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings, all of them leaning with a kind of weary corruption. As Harlan walked toward the general store, he felt the familiar weight of appraisal from the men lounging on the boardwalks. He ignored them, his focus singular. But his solitude was not to be. As he passed the saloon, the doors swung open and Syl Blackwood himself stepped out, followed by Jed. Blackwood was impeccably dressed, a diamond stickpin glinting in his cravat, his silver hair a stark contrast to the town's grime. "Wade," Blackwood said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "Decided to rejoin the living, have you? I was beginning to think the mountain had swallowed you whole. Just needed supplies, Syl," Harlan said, his tone flat. Blackwood's eyes, cold and gray as a winter sky, flickered down, lingering for a fraction of a second on Harlan's boots before meeting his gaze again. "Find anything interesting up there in the dark? Or is it just rocks and loneliness, as usual?" "Just rocks," Harlan lied, the words feeling clumsy in his mouth. "A shame," Blackwood murmured, though his smile suggested otherwise. He gestured with a cigar. "If you ever do strike it rich, you know who to come to. I always offer the best rates." Jed, a hulking man with a perpetual sneer, shifted his weight, his hand resting near the pistol on his hip. Harlan gave a curt nod and moved on, feeling Blackwood's gaze on his back like a physical weight. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that Blackwood had noticed the faint, telltale shimmer of high-grade silver or dust on his worn leather boots. The general store was a refuge of quiet order. The air smelled of coffee beans, calico, and soap. A woman stood behind the counter, her expression kind as she watched him enter. This was Sarah, the widow who ran the store with a quiet competence that defied the town's predatory nature. "Harlan," she said, her voice a soft welcome. "It's been a while." He nodded, suddenly awkward. He grabbed what he needed: flour, beans, a slab of bacon, lamp oil. Then he hesitated, his gaze falling on a small, simple dress of blue calico hanging from a hook. His hand trembled slightly as he took it down. "I'll take this, too," he said, his voice thick. Sarah didn't ask. She simply wrapped the dress with gentle hands, her eyes filled with a sad understanding that was more comforting than any words could have been. "There's a bit of bread left from yesterday's baking, if you'd like," she offered. "No charge for the little one." Harlan looked up, startled. She just smiled faintly. "You've got a father's worry in your eyes, Harlan. I saw it in my own husband." Back at the cabin, he found Alara exactly where he'd left her. The water was untouched, the jerky ignored. He placed the new supplies on the table, then unwrapped the blue dress and held it out. "This is for you." She stared at the dress, then at him, her expression unreadable. He left it on a crate near her corner and began preparing a meal, the silence stretching between them, a vast, unbridgeable chasm. He cooked bacon and mixed a simple johnny cake, the familiar actions a small comfort. The aroma of food filled the cabin, a scent of life in the stagnant air of his grief. Still, she would not emerge. Frustration and a deep, aching sorrow welled up in him. He was failing her, just as he had failed to protect Lily. He slammed the pan down on the hearth, the clatter echoing in the quiet room. "Damn it, child, I'm trying to help you," he growled, more at himself than at her. He turned away, running a hand over his face, the despair threatening to swamp him again. Then he heard it. Tap, 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 tap. It was her rhythm, the one from the mine, coming from her corner. She was speaking to him in the only language she knew. An idea, born of desperation, seized him. He knelt on the rough floorboards, took a deep breath, and answered. He tapped his knuckles against the wood, mimicking her pattern. Tap, 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 tap. The tapping from her corner stopped. The silence was absolute. He waited, his heart pounding. Then, a new rhythm came from the shadows. Tap, 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 tap. A question. He didn't know the language, but he knew a conversation when he heard one. He smiled, a real smile for the first time in a year, and tapped back, an answer of his own making. A few minutes later, a small, dirty hand crept from behind the crates and took the piece of Johnny cake he had left for her. Later that evening, as he coaxed her into letting him wash the layers of grime from her face and hands, he saw what she clutched in her fist. It was a small bird, carved from a piece of dark, polished wood, its lines smooth and flowing. It was a work of love, the product of a skilled and patient hand. This child was not born of the darkness. She was a refugee from a world of light and love, a world that had been violently stolen from her. The mystery of her existence deepened, but for the first time, Harlan felt a flicker not just of responsibility, but of connection. As twilight settled, casting long shadows across the valley, Harlan stepped outside to chop more wood for the night fire. The air was crisp and clean. For a moment, a fragile sense of peace settled over him. He felt, not happy, but purposeful. He paused, leaning on his axe, and let his gaze drift to the high ridge that overlooked his small cabin. His blood ran cold. A glint of light, the unmistakable reflection of the setting sun on glass. He squinted, his eyes tracing the source. A lone figure stood on the ridge, silhouetted against the dying sun. Even at this distance, the bulky shape was recognizable. Jed. And as Harlan watched, frozen, the man raised a pair of binoculars, aiming them directly at the cabin. Their sanctuary was no longer a secret. The wolf was at the door. The glint of sun on glass from the ridge was a memory burned into Harlan's mind. At first light, he was outside, his rifle in hand, circling the cabin in a wide, cautious perimeter. The air was still and cold, the silence of the high desert absolute. And there, near the woodpile, were the tracks, the deep impression of a man's heavy boots, and beside it, the stub of a half-smoked cigar, its cheap, acrid scent a foul violation of the clean mountain air. Jed had been here. He had stood yards from the cabin, watching, waiting. The fragile sanctuary Harlan had offered Alara had been breached before it was ever truly established. He was a fool to think Blackwood would be patient. The wolf was not at the door. It had been sniffing at the threshold all along. Returning to the cabin, he found Alara awake, huddled in her corner, the carved wooden bird clutched in her hand. She watched him, her wide eyes reflecting the dawning light and an uncanny awareness. She knew the piece was false. He knelt, not too close, and began to tap on the floorboards, their new language. Danger. We must leave. He knew what he had to do. Sitting here, waiting for an attack, was a slow death. His only shield, his only weapon against a man like Blackwood, was the law. A piece of paper, stamped and filed in the county seat, was more powerful than a rifle. He had to register the claim, but the thought of leaving Alara alone, even for a day, was a physical sickness in his gut. The ghosts of Martha and Lily rose before him, their faces pale with fever, their small hands reaching for a father who couldn't save them. He would not fail another child. He would not leave her. Her response came, a soft, hesitant tapping. Together, the decision settled on him, heavy and absolute. He would take her with him. It was a terrible risk, exposing her to the harshness of the world, to the prying eyes of men. But the risk of leaving her was greater. He packed a small bundle, water, the last of the bacon, and the blue calico dress, still clean and folded. He also took a small, heavy pouch of the richest silver ore from the vein, his only currency. The journey back to Dust Devil Gulch was a descent into the lion's den. Harlan walked with the rifle held loosely in his arms, Alara a small shadow at his side, her hand clutching the back of his worn coat. He could feel the stares from the saloons in the assayer's office. Whispers followed them like carrion crows. The man from the mountain had returned, and this time, he had brought back a ghost. He went straight to the general store. Sarah was behind the counter, and the warmth in her eyes was a balm on his raw nerves. She took in the sight, Harlan's grim determination, the child half hidden behind him, and her expression softened with a compassion that asked no questions. "I need a wagon, Sarah," he said, his voice low. "And supplies for a few days' travel. I can pay with this." He opened the pouch on the counter. The raw silver glowed with a dull, heavy light, a stark contrast to the store's homespun goods. Sarah's eyes widened, but not with the avarice he was used to seeing. She saw the story behind the silver, the danger, the desperation. "You found something," she said, not a question, but a statement. "A small claim," he lied, the untruth tasting like ash. "Need to get to Carson City to file it before the vultures get wind of it." He nodded vaguely toward the street. "Can't leave the girl." Sarah looked past him to Alara, who was staring, transfixed, at a small brass cage on the counter. Inside, a yellow canary chirped, a bright, cheerful sound that was utterly alien in their world of rock and silence. Alara took a tentative step forward, her eyes locked on the bird. Her lips parted, and a sound, small and fragile as a moth's wing, escaped. "Birdie," she whispered. The word was a shock, a miracle. Harlan froze, turning to stare at her. It was the first sound he had ever heard her make, a ghost of a voice from a life he couldn't imagine. It confirmed everything. The carved toy she clutched, the name she had just spoken. She was not of the mine. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes shining with sudden tears. She understood the significance of the moment. "The wagon is out back," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "Take it, and take what you need. Flour, blankets, coffee. You can pay me when you get back, Harlan, when you're safe." It was an act of profound trust, a quiet rebellion against the town's suffocating greed. Harlan could only nod, his throat too tight for words. As they loaded the wagon, he could feel Jed's eyes on them from across the street. There was no time to lose. He lifted Alara onto the wagon seat, her small body stiff with a mixture of fear and wonder. The world outside the cabin was a terrifying, exhilarating assault on her senses. The journey to Carson City was a race against a shadow. They pushed the horses hard, the wagon rattling over the uneven trail, kicking up a plume of dust that marked their passage across the vast, empty desert. Harlan felt a constant, prickling unease, his eyes scanning the horizon for pursuers. Twice, he saw a distant dust cloud that seemed to be following their path, forcing him to veer off the main trail into the treacherous, rocky canyons that offered cover but slowed their progress. During those 2 days, a fragile bond formed between them. He pointed to the sky, the mountains, the hardy desert plants, naming each one. "Sky," he'd say, and she would look up, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Mountain." He was reintroducing her to a world she had lost, and in doing so, he was reintroducing himself to a life he had forsaken. She, in turn, began to trust him. She shared her jerky with him, a silent offering. And once, as a cold night wind whipped through the canyon where they'd made camp, she moved from her bedroll to huddle closer to the fire, nearer to him. They arrived in Carson City at dusk on the second day, the horses lathered, the wagon coated in a thick layer of dust. The city was a sprawling cacophony of noise and light, a stark contrast to the silence they had left behind. But they had made it. They were exhausted, on the edge of collapse, but they had beaten Blackwood. A wave of triumphant relief washed over Harlan. He pulled the wagon to a stop before the largest building on the main street, a 2-story brick structure with gold lettering on the glass, Territorial Claims Office. Hope, fierce and bright, surged in his chest. He lifted a sleeping Alara from the wagon, her head resting trustingly on his shoulder. He pushed open the heavy oak door. The office was dark. A single sheet of paper was tacked to the inside of the glass. Harlan's eyes strained to read the formal, looping script in the fading light. By order of Territorial Magistrate Caleb Thorne, the notice read, "This office is hereby closed until further notice." Harlan's blood ran cold. He knew that name. Caleb Thorne was a man whose loyalty had been bought and paid for by Silas Blackwood years ago. Blackwood hadn't followed them. He had simply arrived first. They hadn't won the race. They had been led into a carefully prepared trap, and the door had just slammed shut behind them. The closed door of the claims office was a final, damning judgment. Blackwood had not only beaten Harlan to Carson City, he owned the very mechanisms of the law that were supposed to be Harlan's salvation. Despair, thick and cloying, settled back into Harlan's soul. He stood on the boardwalk, a ghost in a city of strangers, the sleeping child in his arms, a latent weight of failure. He had led her out of one prison only to find themselves in a larger, more sophisticated one. Defeated, exposed, and a 2-day ride from even the fragile safety of his cabin, he had nowhere left to run. That's a heavy stone for a man to carry alone. The voice was a low rasp, like rocks grinding together. Harlan turned to see an old man sitting on a bench, whittling a piece of wood. He was a relic from another era, his face a roadmap of desert sun and hard luck. His clothes worn to the texture of soft leather. The man's pale, watery eyes weren't on Harlan, but on the small ore pouch still hanging from Harlan's belt. Comet ore. Ain't seen a sample that clean in 30 years. Harlan instinctively covered the pouch. I don't know what you're talking about. The old prospector gave a dry chuckle. Son, I was pulling silver from these hills when Sil Blackwood was still learning which end of a shovel to hold. I know that mine's signature. And I know the look of a man who's just discovered that the devil owns all the deed books. He finally looked up, his gaze sharp and surprisingly shrewd. Name's Jebediah. And if you're looking for justice in that office, you're digging in the wrong place. A flicker of something, not quite hope, but a reprieve from utter despair, stirred in Harlan. What other place is there? Jebediah spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. Blackwood owns the lock, but he don't own all the keys. The real records, the ones from before his time, they ain't in there. He nodded down a dark, narrow alleyway. Come on, and keep the child covered. Prying eyes in this town are as common as fleas on a stray. Harlan followed, his weariness warring with a desperate need to believe. Jebediah led them away from the main thoroughfare, through a labyrinth of back alleys to a part of the city that had clearly seen better days. They stopped before a small, heavily shuttered cabin that seemed more fortress than home. A faded sign, barely legible, hung crookedly above the door. M. Vance, county clerk and archivist. Retired. Martha Vance, Jebediah explained in a low voice. Blackwood forced her out 5 years back when she wouldn't bend the rules for him. But she was smarter than he gave her credit for. She didn't leave empty-handed. He knocked a specific rhythm on the heavy wooden door. After a long moment, a sliding peephole snapped open, revealing a pair of sharp, suspicious eyes. What do you want, Jebediah? I told you I'm not buying your worthless desert claims. The voice was a woman's, sharp and brittle. Ain't selling today. Martha, we need your help. This man's got a Blackwood problem. The peephole slid shut. They heard the sound of heavy bolts being drawn, and the door opened a crack, chained from the inside. A woman with hair the color of iron and a face etched with bitterness peered out. Blackwood problems ain't my business anymore. Get off my property. He has a child with him, Jebediah pressed. Martha's gaze flickered to Alara, still sleeping in Harlan's arms, and for a second, her harsh expression softened. Harlan stepped forward. Ma'am, he began, my name is Harlan Wade. Blackwood is trying to steal my claim. The one near the old Comet mine. At the mention of the mine, Martha's eyes narrowed. There's nothing left in the Comet but dust and ghosts. I found a new vein, Harlan said. And I found her. He gently shifted Alara so Martha could see the child's face more clearly. She was alive, alone, in the mine. Martha stared at Alara, a strange, dawning recognition in her eyes. The anger in her face slowly gave way to a deep, weary sorrow. She unbolted the chain and swung the door open. Get inside, before his vultures spot you. The cabin's interior was a chaotic archive. Stacks of leather-bound ledgers and dusty boxes filled every available space, a fortress of paper against a corrupt world. Martha barred the door behind them, her movements efficient and practiced. She took a closer look at Alara, who was now stirring, her eyes fluttering open. So, it's true, Martha whispered, more to herself than to them. One of them survived. She looked at Harlan. I knew that family, the Larkins, bright young couple from back east, geologists, had a claim right up against the Comet. They had a little girl, Alara. Her voice broke on the name. They were good people. Harlan, smart, too smart for their own good. They told me they found something big, a mother lode, They were going to file the full survey, but they disappeared about a year ago. Blackwood put it about that they'd abandoned the claim, spooked by the hardships. I never believed it. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place in Harlan's mind. Alara Larkin. The silver was her birthright. Blackwood hadn't just stolen a claim. He had stolen a family's future, and likely their lives. Alara, now fully awake, slid down from Harlan's arms. She looked around the cluttered room, her eyes falling on the woman who watched her with such raw pain. Children have an instinct for shared sorrow. She walked slowly toward Martha, her small hand outstretched. And it was the carved wooden bird. She held it up, a silent offering. Martha sank to her knees, her hardened exterior crumbling. Tears she had held back for years streamed down her face as she took the small, smooth object. He carved this for you, she choked out, her fingers tracing the bird's familiar lines. Your papa. He showed it to me the last time they were in town. The simple, trusting gesture from the child had shattered the walls of bitterness Martha had built around her heart. He killed them, Harlan said, the words a cold certainty. And he left her to die in that mine. Martha's grief hardened into a diamond-edged resolve. Yes, she said, her voice shaking with a new kind of fury. And now, we're going to prove it. For the rest of the night, by the light of a single flickering lamp, they searched. Martha, guided by a memory as sharp as her pain, pulled ledgers from the stacks. Blackwood started buying up influence with the territorial magistrate about 3 years ago, she explained, her fingers flying across the dusty pages. That's when the accidents and disappearances started among the independent miners. They found the Larkins' original filing, a modest claim for exploration, its boundaries clearly marked. Then, in a ledger from a year later, they found what they were looking for, a deed transfer. The entire Larkin claim, including all mineral rights, signed over to a holding company Harlan recognized as one of Blackwood's fronts. The signature's a forgery, Martha spat. I know Michael Larkin's hand. This is a clumsy imitation. She pointed a trembling finger to the bottom of the page. But that's not the worst of it. Look at the witness. Harlan leaned closer, his blood turning to ice as he read the name scrawled beside the forged signature. The witness to the theft of Alara's birthright, the final nail in her parents' coffin, was a name he knew all too well, Jed. Blackwood's foreman. They had him. The proof was right here, the truth written in fading ink in a dusty book. But the knowledge was as dangerous as the silver itself. They were no longer just evading a thief. They were in possession of evidence that could hang him. And as the first light of dawn filtered through the shuttered windows, they knew they were no longer the hunters. They were the hunted, trapped in a tiny cabin with a truth so explosive it could bring down an empire, or bury them all. The pre-dawn stillness in Martha's cabin was so absolute it felt like the held breath before a storm. Harlan watched the faint gray light seep through the cracks in the shutters, his mind a battlefield of strategy and fear. Alara was asleep on a pallet in the small, cellar-like root cellar, a space Martha had insisted was the safest. Jebediah sat slumped in a chair, his old body finally succumbing to exhaustion. The quiet was broken not by a shout, but by a sound far more terrifying. The soft, metallic click of a rifle hammer being cocked just outside the main window. It was a sound Harlan knew from the war, the punctuation mark just before life was ended. Wade! The voice was Jed's, low and confident, amplified by the morning quiet. We know you're in there, and we know you've got what the boss wants. A heavy thud against the door rattled the entire cabin. Send out the girl and the papers, and maybe, just maybe, he'll let the rest of you walk away. Harlan was already moving, his rifle in hand, his body reacting with the fluid economy of a soldier. He gestured for Martha to take cover behind a barricade of heavy ledgers, his eyes locking with hers in a silent acknowledgement. The time for planning was over. She's a child. Jed, Harlan shouted back, his voice a low growl. Whatever quarrel you have is with me. A cruel laugh answered him. That child is the key to the mine. Wade, the boss says she's got a connection to the silver. Now, are you going to make this easy, or are we going to have to burn you out? The siege began without further warning. A bullet splintered the wooden shutter near Harlan's head, showering the room with sharp fragments of wood. He returned fire, aiming not to kill but to suppress, to pin them down. Martha, surprisingly steady, loaded a second rifle from a position across the room. Her face, which had been a mask of bitter resignation for years, was now alive with a fierce, protective fire. They were outgunned, 2 against a half-dozen of Blackwood's hired thugs, but they were not helpless. They were fighting on ground they knew, for a cause that had become more precious than their own lives. For an hour, they held them off. Gunsmoke filled the small cabin, a familiar, acrid scent that transported Harlan back to the blood-soaked fields of Shiloh. During a lull in the shooting, as Jed's men regrouped, Harlan scrambled down into the root cellar to check on Alara. She was awake, her eyes wide in the dim lantern light, but she wasn't crying. She sat beside Jebediah, her small hand on his arm, as if comforting the old man. As Harlan entered, she began to whisper, her voice a fragile thread of sound. Loud noise, like thunder, but inside the mountain. Her eyes were unfocused, seeing a memory. Papa fell down. The rocks were sleeping on him. She shuddered. Mama sang to me. Then she was sleeping, too. The mountain cried. Harlan knelt before her, the pieces of her fractured memory forming a picture of unimaginable horror. The loud noise, explosives. Blackwood hadn't just murdered her parents. He had buried them alive in their own mind, callously sealing the tunnel, never knowing or caring that a small child had survived in a side passage, a silent witness to his monstrous crime. A white-hot rage, pure and clean, burned away the last vestiges of Harlan's grief-fueled apathy. This was no longer just about protecting a child or a claim. This was about vengeance. This was about justice for the Larkins. He returned to the main room, his face set like granite. He used explosives. Martha. He buried them. Martha's face hardened. That devil. I knew he was capable of anything. We can't win a straight fight, Harlan said, his mind racing. We need to get Alara and the proof out of here. His eyes fell on a heavy bearskin rug in the corner of the room. Martha, your escape tunnel. Where does it lead? A quarter-mile east, into a dry creek bed, she answered, understanding dawning. The plan was desperate, forged in gunpowder and whispers. Jebediah, old and frail but wiry in knowing the terrain, would take Alara and the precious ledger with Jed's signature through the tunnel. They would head for Dust Devil Gulch. Harlan had seen the spark of defiance in Sarah's eyes. She was their only hope. Harlan, meanwhile, would create a diversion, something big enough to draw every one of Jed's men away from the cabin and give the others a chance to escape. The goodbye was a tear in his soul. He knelt before Alara in the darkness of the tunnel's entrance. He pressed a small pouch of water into her hands. Jebediah will keep you safe, he whispered, his voice thick. You be brave for me, little bird. You fly. She looked up at him, her luminous eyes seeming to see straight into his heart. For the first time, she reached out and touched his face, her small, cool fingers tracing the rough line of his jaw. Then, she was gone, disappearing into the blackness with Jebediah, taking with her the future he had just begun to imagine. Harlan crawled back into the cabin, his heart a hollow ache. He turned to Martha. Get ready. He took a deep breath, gathered the last of their ammunition, and slipped out the back of the cabin, using the cover of a thicket of scrub oak to make his way up the rocky slope behind the house. His target was a precarious overhang of loose rock and scree directly above the position where Jed's men were taking cover. It was a wild, desperate gamble. He worked with frantic energy, using a crowbar from Martha's woodshed to pry at the keystones holding the rock formation in place. Below, the firing had resumed. He could hear bullets thudding into the cabin's logs. He had to hurry. With a final, desperate heave, the keystone gave way. The mountain groaned, a deep, terrible sound that echoed through the canyon. A river of rock and dust cascaded down the slope, a man-made avalanche of raw, destructive power. He saw Jed's men look up, their faces masks of terror, before they were consumed by the sliding earth. The diversion was a success. The siege was broken. But as the dust began to settle, Harlan saw that the rock slide had been larger than he'd anticipated. It had not only buried Jed's position, but had also swept across the very path he had used to climb the slope. His way back was gone. He was trapped on the high ridge, exposed and alone. Miles away, Jebediah and Alara emerged from the tunnel into the pre-dawn gloom. They moved with cautious haste, the lights of Dust Devil Gulch a faint promise on the horizon. The creek bed offered good cover, its winding path obscuring them from view. They were almost clear of the canyons, almost within sight of the open plains, when a figure stepped from behind a towering rock formation, blocking their path. It was not Jed. It was a man dressed in a fine city coat, his silver hair gleaming in the first light of dawn. "That's far enough, old man," Silas Blackwood said, his voice calm and utterly final. A pistol was held loosely in his hand. "I'll take the girl now. And the book? She has a story to tell me, a story written in silver." He took a step forward, his hand reaching for Alara, his victory absolute. Silas Blackwood's victory was a cold, sharp thing, held in the glint of his pistol and the terror in Jebediah's eyes. He savored the moment, the absolute control. "The mind speaks to her," he said, his voice a low, possessive purr as he reached for Alara. "And now, she'll speak to me." He saw the future spooling out before him. A river of silver, a territorial empire built on a child's fractured memories. But as his fingers brushed Alara's ragged sleeve, a sound sliced through the canyon, thin, piercing, and utterly defiant. It was the whistle of a bird, a clear, three-note call that was both a lament and a war cry, the secret signal her father had carved into the heart of a wooden toy. Before Blackwood could react, the dead landscape came alive. Figures rose from behind the rocks, their silhouettes stark against the dawn sky. It was Sarah, her face set with grim determination, a shotgun held steady in her hands. Beside her stood the blacksmith, the livery owner, and a half-dozen other miners and ranchers. The forgotten men of Dust Devil Gulch, the ones Blackwood had bled dry for years. They were not an army, armed with little more than mining picks, old hunting rifles, and a collective, simmering rage that had finally boiled over. "That's far enough, Sil," Sarah's voice rang out, clear and steady. "The town's come to collect its dues." Trapped, Blackwood's composure finally shattered. He grabbed Alara, pulling her in front of him as a shield, the pistol pressed against her small head. Get back, or the child dies first." Meanwhile, high on the ridge, Harlan had found his way down. The rock slide had taken out his path, but it had also revealed an old, treacherous goat trail on the far side of the slope. He scrambled down, his hands raw, his lungs burning. He heard the whistle and knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that it was a signal meant for him. He followed the sound, his movements fueled by a desperate, prayerful urgency. He arrived at the standoff to a scene of unbearable tension. Blackwood, cornered and desperate, held Alara hostage. The townsfolk were a frozen tableau of fury and helplessness. And there, at the center of it all, was the child, her eyes locked on Blackwood, not with fear, but with a strange, unnerving clarity. At the same moment, Harlan confronted Jed at the cabin. The foreman, dazed from the rock slide but alive, was trying to pull himself from the rubble. Harlan was on him in an instant, the fight a brutal, silent explosion of grief and rage. It wasn't a fight for silver. It was a reckoning. Harlan slammed Jed against a rock, the foreman's rifle clattering away. "You helped murder them," Harlan snarled, his face inches from Jed's. "You left a child to die in the dark." Jed's eyes were wide with terror, not of Harlan, but of the ghost he saw behind him. Harlan subdued him, binding his hands with a length of rope from his own pack. He would not kill him. Killing was too easy an escape. He would leave Jed for the law, for the slow, grinding justice of a prison cell. Back in the canyon, Blackwood's desperation grew. "I own this land. I own this town," he screamed, his voice cracking. "She is mine." He started to drag Alara away. But the child, who had been a silent, spectral presence for so long, found her anchor. She planted her small feet in the dust and looked from Blackwood's monstrous face to the newly arrived figure of Harlan, standing at the edge of the canyon, his chest heaving, his face a mask of righteous fury. A memory, whole and complete, broke through the fog of her trauma. Her father, her real father, standing between her and a different kind of darkness. Her voice, when it came, was not a whisper, but a clear, ringing bell of truth. "You hurt my papa," she said, her eyes fixed on Blackwood. "You made the mountain cry." The words, so simple and so pure, were a judgment. It was the voice of the mine itself, of the land, of every soul Blackwood had crushed. It was the final catalyst. With a collective roar, the townsfolk surged forward. Blackwood, stunned by the child's voice, was a moment too slow. He was overwhelmed, not by a mob, but by a community reclaiming its soul. The pistol was knocked from his hand. He was seized, bound, and his reign of terror was over. He was not beaten or lynched. He was simply captured, an impotent tyrant destined to face the very laws he had so long perverted. Harlan ran to Alara, sweeping her into his arms, holding her as if he could pour all the loss and fear and love from his own heart into her small, trembling body. "I've got you," he whispered, over and over. "I've got you." She buried her face in his shoulder, her own voice returning in a flood of broken, healing words. "Papa," she cried. "Papa." 1 year later, the Nevada sun cast a warm, benevolent light over Dust Devil Gulch. The town was no longer a scar on the land, but a place of tentative, vibrant life. The change was most visible in the new building at the center of town, the Larkin School and Community Hall. The Comet Mine, its true ownership legally restored to Alara Larkin, had become the heart of the town's rebirth. Under Harlan's management, it was operated as a community cooperative. A portion of the profits from the silver vein, Alara's vein, they called it, went to a town fund that had paid for the school, for a proper doctor's office, and for fair wages for the miners. Sarah's general store was thriving, its shelves full, its atmosphere a hub of quiet conversation and renewed hope. Martha Vance, coaxed from her fortress of paper, was now the town's official clerk and respected archivist, her sharp mind and fierce integrity ensuring that no truth would ever be buried again. Harlan stood on the porch of a small, neatly built house, watching Alara chase butterflies in a field of wildflowers. She was no longer a ghost. She was a child, her laughter a constant, joyful music, her voice now clear and strong, though she still preferred the quiet language of tapping when she and Harlan shared a secret. He had not replaced her father, but had become one, a role he wore with a quiet, profound gratitude. Sarah came to stand beside him, her hand finding his in a gesture of comfortable intimacy. "She looks happy," Sarah said. "We all are," Harlan replied, squeezing her hand. Theirs was a family forged in crisis, built not on shared blood but on shared courage. That evening, as the three of them sat around the dinner table, the small carved bird Alara's father had made sat on the mantelpiece, a silent guardian. Alara, now 8 years old, looked up from her plate. "Martha told me today that Dust Devil Gulch is a bad name," she said thoughtfully. "She said we should call it something else." Harlan smiled. "What do you think we should call it?" Little bird, Alara's eyes, so like the silver they had found in the darkness, shone with an idea. "I think we should call it Hope," she said, "because that's what we found here." Harlan looked at Sarah, whose eyes were shining with tears, and then at the remarkable child who had led him back into the light. The man who had gone into the darkness of the earth seeking an end had found not just a fortune in silver, but a vein of hope, richer and more enduring than any precious metal. And in the heart of the Nevada desert, a town and a family had found their redemption.